The following video is an excerpt from a lesson that occurred as a transition between instruction on genetic mechanisms causing variation to instruction on natural selection. Like all classes, students work in engineered groups of 3 to 4. Each student has a name tent and a UGTA assigned to their group. The overarching goal of the lesson is for students to engage in cross-case comparisons of biological phenomena, in this case milk digestion, elephant tusks, human skin, and mouse fur. And they do this in order to collaboratively build abstract conceptual models that are capable of explaining seemingly disparate patterns. The lesson engages students in biology using nature of science ideas like observation, inference, model, process, and pattern. The term natural selection was purposely not stated during the lesson. The following slides will provide information on the learning objectives and the instructions given to students for this in-class activity. The red check marks shown here indicate objectives addressed in a prior class.
So is there a group that would like to kind of walk us through elephant tusks?
Should I just start from A?
Go for it. What are the heritable variants that exist in this species?
The variants are elephants with tusks versus elephants with no tusks.
What processes produce these heritable variants?
So there's a selective advantage in the environment. If the elephants live in an area with high levels of poaching, those without tusks are less likely to get killed for their non-existent tusks.
Okay.
So as generations go, it becomes that the elephants with no tusks survive and reproduce and pass on their genes.
Okay. So the processes that's producing these variants, your group is saying has to do with it being beneficial to have it in some cases.
Right. And we also thought that perhaps if there was no danger of poaching, then the elephants without tusks would be at a disadvantage.
Okay. So this, I am so glad you brought this up, because this is a very intuitive idea. It's reasonable, it's logical, it's a very common idea, one that many scientists have had for decades, but it's actually scientifically inaccurate. I know, right? But I am so glad you brought this up, because it's a really, really hard aspect to all of this and a really common idea. Does someone have a sense about why it might be inaccurate? To answer this question about what processes produce heritable variants, does the answer have to do with whether or not it's beneficial in your given environment?
So the processes that produce heritable variants are happening all the time.
Okay.
So for example, like mutation happens very commonly. So that can produce different heritable variants, but the relative frequency of those variants in a population will depend on the environment that favors certain things.
So am I correct that I'm maybe hearing a distinction here between the frequency or how common a variant is and the production of the variant, whether or not the variant exists in the first place? Right? We're actually talking about two really important things here that are different from each other. Whether it's valuable or not to you as an individual, whether a particular mutation helps you in your environment, that does not influence at all if that variant will appear in the population. So the production of heritable variants has nothing to do with how beneficial it might be in the environment. Doesn't impact at all what new variants are produced. But the environment does impact, as you saw in this video, how those variants that already exist change in frequency from one generation to the next. Do they increase in frequency? Do they become more common, perhaps because they are beneficial to individuals that live in this population? Or do they perhaps decrease in frequency, or do they stay the same?
The misconception like that it's like due to the environment, is it because probably that beneficial variant is the one that survives? That's why it seems like it's almost like the environment that's causing it.
Yeah, I mean, it really is intuitive that the environment seems to somehow cause these beneficial mutations. It's so intuitive, but it's just not possible. Your cells, as they're replicating, they have no idea what's going on in the environment in terms of what might be beneficial. They can't tell the future. They have no idea. Mutations just happen by chance. Really critical distinction between the processes that produce variation, which include things like mutation, recombination, and independent assortment, and the processes that change how common an already existing variant is. Let's hear from group 11. And don't worry if you've got some holes in this picture. Okay, processes that produce the heritable variants within the species.
I wrote natural selection in individuals with the more beneficial trait relative to their location. Like in the video, they explain how people living in harsher climates toward the equator have darker skin to deflect more of a UV radiation that comes from the sun.
Anyone want to follow up on that?
I think we're, approaching the same idea as it was with the elephant tusks. Like maybe there's like a random mutation, and then it's not so much that the environment is causing the mutations, but rather just mutations that end up being beneficial in that environment are prevailing.
Does that make sense?
The relation, like what, like how you said the environment doesn't really have it doesn't influence like the mutations that are occurring more often, right? Like if there's heavy poaching, then you get like a greater mutation of. I guess I'm still confused about what exactly is going on.
Sharika, I am so thankful that you are sharing this because it is really hard, and actually I think a lot of people in this room feel the same way. Keep in mind how much genetic variation we're all producing. We each make millions of different gametes that all have different variants. We have mutations that happen in all of our gametes. The amount of genetic variation is utterly enormous in species. And actually, you have to believe this for the rest of this story to make sense. It's totally random what ends up being produced. Now that it's there, those individuals with variants that make them, just by chance, more able to survive and reproduce, those variants are the ones that will increase in frequency, and several generations later, you may see the whole population has that variant because everyone else died or failed to reproduce. Sheknoza, yes. Okay, can we get a microphone to Sheknoza? What processes produce heritable variants?
So the MC1R gene was always there, so I guess just like through mutation.
Okay, and then how about survival being beneficial based on your heritable variants or not?
So it depended on where the mice lived, whether it was on the lava flow or on the sand. If you had dark fur color on the lava flow, you had a better chance of survival because you can camouflage against predators, and the same thing for light colored in the sand because you blend in.
So Sheknoza, do you think that this MCR1 mutation occurred more frequently in this population that was on the lava flow?
I would say so because the mice that had that gene were able to survive and pass on that mutation.
Okay. Okay, Sunny's going to share.
Yeah, so this is kind of like what we've been talking about all class. So I think that the mutation happened at some point in history, and then it wasn't necessarily that that mutation was happening more often because of the environment. It was more so that the environment was allowing that mutation to be passed on more often. So so because more black mice started appearing on the dark lava flow, it wasn't because the environment was causing these new mice to have these dark black mutations. It was more so because the initial mice, the few mice that got the mutation in the first place, were able to survive and pass their genes on more often than the other mice.